Hello and welcome to the Political Dispatch, the podcast that explores the big ideas and policies shaping our world.
I'm Lily Mott.
I'm Sid Kurapati.
And I'm Tom Spare.
We are going to be talking today about UK universities. This month, over 800,000 students across Wales, England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland will be graduating. And we are 3 of those students graduating.
Exactly, Lily. By the time this episode airs, we will be graduates of Cardiff University. How about that, huh? Tom and I will have Masters in Political Communication, and you will have an MA in Digital Media and Society. Woohoo! Yay!
Go us. However, our university has been at the centre of a financial storm that has received a lot of media attention over the last couple of months. Back in January, Cardiff University announced a plan entitled Securing Our Academic Future, which proposed a raft of cuts across the institution, including closing the School of Modern Languages, the School of Music, and courses like nursing, archaeology, and philosophy.
Since January, however, those cuts have been scaled back, thanks in part to lots of staff taking redundancy and some concessions by senior management after public uproar, media criticism, lobbying by academics, and the trade unions.
Cardiff's recent tumultuous financial history is emblematic of a much larger systematic flaw in the way UK universities are funded. And we're going to dedicate the start of this episode to that history to look at why university finances are in such dire circumstances.
And obviously, we don't want to be all doom and gloom. That was so 2024. No, we also want to have a discussion about our experiences of going to university. The 3 of us are from different countries. Education is run very differently in the US, in the UK, and in India. So we also want to talk about our experiences of studying at Cardiff University, what we learned, what we wish to have known going in, and we'll offer some advice to our fellow graduates who are facing a challenging world economically, socially, politically, and indeed environmentally.
Let's zoom out for a moment away from graduation and take a bird's eye view of the university sector, the education system, and in particular, what has caused the recent financial troubles for UK universities. Back in April, in response to the cuts at Cardiff University, Tom produced an episode of his podcast, Spare Thought. He interviewed a number of staff, students, and alumni to understand the causes of the crisis. Here's a clip from an interview with Professor Dylan Jones-Evans, OBE, who gave a summary of the problems faced by universities.
Why are universities having to cut staff? It'd be good to get a brief overview of how we got to this point.
It's an interesting way you frame that question, because you've said, why are universities having to cut staff? I don't think universities have to cut staff. I think the challenge is clearly the financial difficulties that universities find themselves in. There are different reasons for this. There's the wider context, as we see, in terms of, income for universities, which is both home fees and international fees. So the challenge with home fees, which provide the majority of the funding at the moment for universities, is that it was essentially frozen about 7 years ago at 9,250 or whatever it was. In Wales, it was slightly less at 9,000. And the problem is with that, of course, is that would have been fine when inflation was at about 1-2%. But when obviously you had these inflationary pressures that came post-COVID, you were hitting inflation rates of 11%. Energy costs were going up. Universities are massive, large institutions that need a lot of heating and lighting. All of a sudden, the costs went higher, and their model hadn't adequately accounted for this. And to be fair, the UK government didn't respond at all to these pressures. And what should have happened, and of course, when you're in a post-COVID world, it's very difficult for government to say, we're going to increase. You lose a lot of votes by increasing fees on students. So what it should have done, it should have been tagged to inflation. So now that fee should have been at around £12,000. So like everything else, that would have gone up. But unfortunately, it didn't. So you had to meet that sort of gap. At the same time, you have international students. And clearly, some institutions like Cardiff University have always had a significant proportion of international students. About 30 to 35% of their income has come over the last few years from that, because they've shifted, like most Russell Group, to having about a 2/3 split, because those international students bring in, shall we say, the sugar, the honey, they bring in the additional funding you need to be able to spend on things like very expensive buildings. The problem was, of course, was that most of the post-92 institutions were in that situation. So they expanded very quickly because they were losing students. Of course, their costs were going down. So essentially their home students were losing money and they were substituting for that loss by trying to increase. So you had a situation in Wales, for example, if you look at the University of South Wales, probably around, I think it was about 2018, 19, 11% of their fees income came from international students. In 24, it was 38%. So you can see a massive shift in strategy in terms of their financial strategy from having a relatively small proportion of international students to having a significant number of international students, and more importantly, income, which obviously, when the market fell, had an effect. So those are the two biggest issues, I think, is this. It's all about the income. It's all about the costs. But more importantly, it's about, how individual universities have actually managed themselves over the last few years, but more importantly, how they responded to these crises as we go forward.
So that gives us an overview of the current crisis. But I wonder if we need to go even further back. Luckily, we have Tom on hand who can give us a bit of an overview of the sector. Tom, over to you, mate.
Cool. Thanks, Sid. So, the expansion of universities. In the late 90s, Tony Blair famously said that his government was all about education, education, education. And he's widely credited with setting the target of 50% of young people attending university. But it was under his predecessor, Sir John Major, that saw the passing of legislation to vastly expand the higher education sector. And when we say higher education, we mean sort of post-schooling, basically. So after school, college, so post 16 education, and then most students if you go to university, you'll go to university around the age of 18, 19. There's obviously a big mature student population as well, but traditionally it's you go straight after school. The Further and Higher Education Act of 1992 granted polytechnic institutions university status, and these were very technical courses, vocational courses. A lot of teachers were taught in polytechnics, for example, nearly doubling the number of universities in the UK, and it set the groundwork for introducing tuition fees and the marketisation of higher education. In the early 90s, the Universities and College Admissions Service, UCAS, created by the legislation, has seen annual university applications increase from 400,000 students in 1993 to roughly 780,000 by 2021. By 2022, there were some 2.9 million students studying in the UK. A second piece of legislation, the Education Act of 1994, was designed to curtail the political and campaigning sway of student unions. These are organisations that are run by students for students, directing unions to support students as learners rather than activists. The legislation also mandated student unions to publish regular financial statements to its members, its students, and in turn led to the professionalisation of the student union administration. So that was all through the Education Act. The political power of the unions has diminished over time, best represented in the National Union of Students, the organisation that represents some 7 million further and higher education students across the UK. It's the largest trade union body in the UK. By 2019, the NUS was facing huge challenges, particularly after a 2019 financial crisis. They've recovered a bit since then, but it's really in the last 20 years or so, their power and influence has sort of waxed and waned quite a lot. So where does all the money come from? Progressively through the late 90s and into the mid-2010s, a growing percentage of university income was generated by tuition fees. The fees, controversially introduced during the Blair years, helped support investment in university facilities, staffing, and teaching quality. However, when the coalition government came into power in 2010 between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, the age of austerity began. The funding structure radically changed. Famously, the Liberal Democrats voted with their Conservative coalition partners to treble tuition fees to around £9,000, breaking a manifesto pledge, and market forces were unleashed onto the sector. Within a handful of years, student debt had outgrown historic credit card debt. government funding for universities shrank, and students became consumers. So when we talk about students as consumers, along with a lot of the fees came a tremendous amount of regulation. Tuition fees injected funds into university coffers, but it did not take long before the cracks started showing. The funding model proposed by the coalition government assumed that not all universities would charge the full £9,000 for tuition, hoping that the cream of the crop, like Oxford, Cambridge, and St Andrews, would charge top dollar, and the institutions further down the chain would charge less. This was a fatal miscalculation. Pretty much every single university charged the maximum amount. Several attempts were made to create a tiered higher education sector, using exercises like the Teaching Excellence Framework to delineate between the best and the worst teaching quality in the sector. However, some of the big names didn't get the gilded gold status, and plenty of post-1992 institutions, former polytechnics, did very well. Devolution sheltered Scottish, Welsh, and Northern Irish students from tuition fee hikes, but financial challenges for universities under devolved governments remains a huge challenge too, and for different reasons as well. It's worth bearing in mind, since 2010, I think there's been 12 or 13 ministers responsible for higher education in the UK government. It's led to muddled policy making, particularly in the area of consumer rights. So you have a thing called the Consumer Marketing Authority, which meaning that universities and other higher education providers if they didn't meet their obligations to undergraduate students, they might face a breach in consumer protection law. So you suddenly start seeing a lot more universities taking their university to court, for example. So in England, through that, they created the Office for Students, which is all about trying to keep universities to account and representing students, but it doesn't sort of do it struggles to do a lot of that because of the limitations of its regulatory powers. And in Wales, there's recently been the creation of the Commission for Tertiary Education and Research, known as MEDA, which is set up to regulate for further education, higher education, apprenticeships, adult community learning, and local authority maintained school sixth forms. So as we go through time, as lots of the financial problems are gaining traction, the COVID-19 pandemic strikes, and that has transformed so much of British life, so particularly in trusts in institutions and education. So back in the autumn of 2020, as controversy raged about A-level results, universities scrambled to get campus ready to deliver teaching and run events. I experienced the impacts firsthand of COVID as a staff member planning airport collection for international students between 2019 and 2022. We had to request a massive increase to our budget to cater for social distancing and all the knock-on effects of using additional vehicles, PPE, and the complexity of drop-offs. Universities across the UK chartered flights for international students, housed them in hotels to see out quarantine, and did their best to deliver events to connect students. COVID rules made these efforts incredibly challenging. So the current financial situation is a combination of COVID happening, but also the cost of living crisis, in part caused by the Russian-Ukraine war, Liz Truss's adventure into economics in her mini budget, and rising inflation, so together with a more hostile environment towards migrants, most recently against international students. These things combine to create the situation where we have today, where some universities will be struggling to pay their bills by the end of this academic year. I think it's a good time to pause, because that's a lot of information thrown at everyone, to reflect on the information I've just shared. Sid, Lily, what are your thoughts on how things have played out in the events that I've described?
I think, first of all, Tom, that's a great zeitgeist of the education legislation by the UK government and how it has impacted students, organizations, and the universities as a whole. For that matter, even the system, how it's been systematically, impacted by some good decisions, others dodgy decisions. And the fact of the matter is, every decision that has been made since the 90s has had impact and has brought us to this situation right now. As an international student here in the UK, I think one of the things which I've realized is that, and I've sort of read about this as well, that there is a massive dependency on international students across UK universities. Because the fees that is charged to international students is substantially higher than what is charged to UK citizens. And that makes it financially viable for the universities to run these programs. So when you have legislations that cut down on immigration or make it more difficult for international students to exist or to get jobs in an economy here in the UK, it directly impacts the number of students who are coming into the UK, and therefore the financial viability of a lot of the universities, which may not be, say top tier, but a lot of the universities which are there in the Russell Group do get affected. Say, for example, Cardiff University, right? And that forces them to take certain hard decisions, which may make financial sense, but lack the empathy, or they might not be politically sound decisions at the end of the day. So that's something which I've realized is impacting a lot of the American universities as well, and I'm sure Lily's going to agree with me on that too. However, I think the system of education, or the way they teach the courses, is something which I've really liked being here. And that is the other side of it. That despite these financial hurdles or these systemic issues, which almost all countries tend to have, maybe they're much larger and much graver in this country, you do still deliver quality education. And for me, that barometer is based on how education is in India, right? So from what I've learned is that the UK system, higher education system, focuses on you figuring out, or you doing research by yourself, getting to know more about the topic that you're studying, and then presenting your views in a format which are based on specific guidelines. But you have to go ahead and put your point forward however well possible that you can, which is great, because it forces you in a good way to be more articulate, more thorough with your research, not just in terms of how in-depth it is, but like how accurate it is and how well you're actually making your argument. And that's something which is really good. And considering that we studied political communication, I think it's just very paramount that anybody in that field does that, right? And I also realized that I think the government has realized this problem, that it's there, and they are seeing a public backlash on these things. One could say that the Cardiff University was an experiment to see how public might react to this, and then might be implemented across other places as well. But to fix this issue is going to take some more legislation, or maybe repealing certain legislations which caused the problems initially, right? And yeah, and for them to do that, I think there's going to be a massive relook over the next 3-4 years on how government is spending money. Right now, I think they've made the priorities very clear on how immigration is kind of affecting the country, with Keir Starmer's speech on a country of strangers. If I'm not wrong, that's what he said, right? And then, implementing some of the things from the white paper that they had presented, and so on. So that those things will invariably make it difficult for international students to come here. I mean, it took me a while to get a job. It took me months. So these problems will take time to get fixed, but it really boils down to how the government will approach in solving the problem, where sometimes governments can overdo it. They will probably get too involved into the thing, and then then it becomes a very highly regulated system, and that further collapses the foundations that may or may not have existed, right? So I think it's a wait and watch sort of a situation. And but for any student who is planning to come to the UK, the style of teaching is really amazing. That's something which I will say. But start applying for internships the second you land in this country. You know, try and puff up that CV as much as you can with internships, work placements. It doesn't matter when you're studying, just go ahead and do it, buddy. That's only going to make your life easier once you graduate, once you submitted your dissertation. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on it. 2 pennies on it. That's it. Let's call it that.
And Lily, what are your thoughts?
I do think it's really interesting to be here at a time where so much is changing in the British university system, because I think coming from the US, and I was part of a program where a lot of Americans came together and we studied at different universities across the UK. So I think that I heard about a lot of different types of programs through that, and also about a lot of different universities. So there was people in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and in England. And all of us had pretty different experiences, not necessarily in the courses that we were taking or the university structure. I think, Sid, you really hit the nail on the head with the type of instruction that we got, because I do think in the UK it is so much more individualized, and it's very much, we are going to give you this prompt and it's on you to do that research and to figure out what the topic is that you're going to cover and to kind of find your own way. And I think that the professors have been very open and supportive with helping you find that. But I do think it's very different from the US system. And a lot of American students actually really didn't like it in the program that I was a part of, because we are very used to having a lot of instruction in the US. I will say, I think then that makes my expectations of a degree a little bit different. So I'm going to give a quick stat while you were talking, Sid. I looked this up. I went to Washington and Lee University for my undergrad, which is a private school in the US. So there are public schools and there are private schools. Public schools are still very expensive in the US, but a lot of times, so public schools were created as a way to try to make university more affordable. You can get in-state tuition if you're a citizen of that university. So for me, I'm from Colorado. If I went to University of Colorado Boulder, I would have gotten a big discount because I went to school in my home state. Out-of-state students pay more, which I think can be equated to the international student fees, because in the US, all of our states are very different. So it is like you're traveling to a different place to go to university. A lot of times it's pretty negligible, the difference. Like, it's not a huge amount. Whereas I think in the UK, international student fees and home student fees are very different. I know that's not the case like entirely, but also in the US, there are a lot of different opportunities to get scholarships and to get money to go to the university. So I'm putting a little caveat on all of this, but my university that I went to, Washington and Lee, cost $91,700 last year. That's books, that's tuition, that's room and board, that's a health service, all of that. So I think the double-edged sword here is that I think that I come from a system where we pay a lot more for school. So I think sometimes when I'm thinking about the tuition fees, I have a really hard time like contextualizing them in my brain. But however, I do think that since the UK's system is much more individualized and it's much more, you can kind of attend class or not, and people do that in the US too. I'm not saying that it's but I think it's much more, we're going to give you the materials and you go and do it on your own. Whereas in the US, we would attend class every day and have assignments, and our professors would be grading. And it's almost like you're living in this super intense training program for your given career. However, I do think that because you've been in that intense training program, we are ready to do our careers right out of the gate. So like me graduating from my undergraduate university, I was ready to become a journalist because I had pretty much practiced as a journalist for 4 years. So I think it is like the UK and the US systems, and I'd be really interested to know more about the Indian system, Sid. But I think that we have different priorities with education, which I think we can kind of get back to like what that means and maybe why we should be paying more or less. You know, I think it's hard to put a price tag on things. But I think in the US, like, the purpose of college is to get you ready to jump right into your career and make money. The US is obviously incredibly capitalist. That's like our focus. So it's this training program to make you money once you get out. And then hopefully you'll be able to return on that $91,000 that you paid every year for university. But in the UK, I do think that, at least in my experience, it feels like UK universities are helping you to think a lot more, and they're helping you to kind of learn how to communicate with people. And I think that that's a really good thing. And it does teach you a lot of individualism, which I think is good. You do have to really exist on your own, whereas in the US, it sometimes feels like a little country club where like your meals are provided for you, you live on campus, there's a shuttle that takes you where you need to go, all of this kind of stuff. Whereas in the UK, it did feel a lot more like we're gonna give you the stuff, but it's on you to do it, and it's also on you to stay alive. So I think that was kind of the difference for me going to undergrad for 1 year in the UK, and then of course doing my master's in the UK compared to the US. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. I think that's just very much a brain dump when I think about the differences, and not sure which one's wrong or right. I just do think that they have positives and negatives depending on what you want out of an educational system. But yeah, thoughts.
Yeah, I mean that's very interesting to know that, Lily. And wow, that, hearing the fees of your undergrad, sorry to say, but like, woof, that's quite a bit. Yeah. I think from an Indian system perspective, I think there's a couple of points which I just remembered and I thought I'll add after after hearing what you were saying. There's a lot of depending on what course you're doing in the higher education sector of the education system, it's really focused on drilling the foundations really strongly into you. And while that's great, it doesn't really focus on building critical thinking and the ideas of, you making it out there by yourself. The curriculum is not really, or the teaching is not really designed that way. And it is difficult because we have the highest population in the world. So how do you actually go ahead and ensure that everybody's employable? So there is going to be a gap there. Having said that, I think we have a similar system where the public universities are government funded or, government aided. These are substantially more affordable compared to private universities, which charge maybe even 10 times or 20 times the amount. But the infrastructure and sometimes in many occasions, the quality of teaching is much better in the private institutions. So people do tend to go, whoever can afford, of course, do tend to go there. There is a lack of scholarship system at this point in time in the Indian education system, but we do have reservations that ensures that the entry to or somebody getting admission, somebody who is from a disadvantaged group, be it socially or ethnically or financially, they might get some leeway into that. But there are chinks in the armor in that section as well. So people tend to, mess around with that and kind of find their way through it. And then, they occupy that seat and so on and so forth. But that's one of the big differences that is there. The idea that there's no, they're not really instilling the whole concept of critical thinking among students. Very few universities do that in India, but most are not doing that. And I think a lot of students are realizing that and are kind of demanding that sort of change, which is really interesting. Secondly, it kind of, when you were speaking about your undergrad experience, it kind of brought me back to mine. And there was one particular instance which I remembered. So once we finish our board examinations, which are like the A levels over here, we have things called cutoffs, where if you get, a certain percentage and above, then you can try and apply to certain universities or certain colleges, which are known as the top colleges, and you can apply to those. So when I finished, my 12th grade board examinations, and that's when the main university in Delhi, the Delhi University, announced cutoffs for English program, which was 100%. So you needed 100% in English, which is practically impossible to actually get into one of the top colleges in Delhi University, which was ridiculous. And I knew I was never going to get like even close to 90 or whatever. So I was like, hey, I'm just going to apply outside the state. I'm going to apply to some private universities, just apply and don't even bother, looking at these cutoffs because you're never going to make it. And a lot of criticism came from the students and parents and the citizens in general against the government, saying that government universities are, doing this, what the hell, and so on and so forth. And it kind of made me realize or made me notice over a period of time that every time the government of India has interfered with the education system to try and say, oh, we're going to change the system, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and try and emulate certain things which are there in the West, or try and emulate certain best practices or impose them without trying to understand the local sort of diaspora or the culture or the impact that it might have on the system itself. Those experiments have failed. So the more autonomy that's given to universities and government being just, okay, this is what's been earmarked to you. Here it is, take it. We're not going to interfere with how you run your system and so on. The better it is for universities, at least in an Indian context. And but successive governments, both from the center left and the center right, have tried to fiddle with it. And the current incumbent government introduced something called the New Education Policy, which is to go ahead and change the entire curriculum from kindergarten all the way to, undergrad, which some parts were fine, but a lot of parts were like ridiculous. So anyway, that's a bit of a nutshell, a kuch gesagt of the Indian education system from my perspective.
Cool. Thanks for that, Sid. And also to be able to compare it to your experience in the US system, Lily. I was going to ask about what drew you to the UK and Cardiff. I guess we could do that briefly, but also it'd be great to hear what some of the highlights were of studying at Cardiff. Obviously, doing this podcast is really cool that we're able to carry on and continue to be connected in that way. And then maybe some of the lessons that you learned from doing your MA. So, Lily, in a nutshell, what sort of brought you to the UK? Why did you want to come to the UK? Rather than say Cardiff specifically, what are some of the highlights and then maybe some of the lessons that you've learned?
Yeah, I think also I want to know this actually just from both of you, and this might be a little bit deep, but I would love when we do our reflections, I'll answer that question, Tom, but when we do our reflections, can we do one highlight from the year and then one thing that you wish you would have done or could have done differently? Obviously, can't take it back, but I think that I've been thinking about this as we approach graduation. But I think for me, what drew me to the UK and to Cardiff specifically was actually the JOMEC. I feel like we don't really give the JOMEC credit enough. So I was at the Children's Media Conference last week, and whenever I mentioned that I went to Cardiff and did my master's there, people were like, Cardiff? Like it was like this whole thing, which was really incredible because I do think when I was there, I just really did not understand how incredible the professors were and who these people were and the proximity to the BBC. And I just think that I knew that going into Cardiff, but when I was there, I guess I didn't appreciate it enough. So I think that was my biggest draw was I think the journalism tradition that Cardiff University has and the proximity to the BBC was really great because obviously I think I've had my sights set on journalism and storytelling in some way. So I think I was thinking about career choices with that. And of course, now I'm going in a slightly different way from the BBC, but still really cool to be close to it. And I do think there was a lot of overlap with our professors and everything because we have that tradition of journalism and the commitment to journalism. So I am super, super glad that I chose Cardiff. I also think being in Wales was something that drew me there. I think I've talked about it on this podcast before, but I spent a year at Oxford, which was very different because in Oxford, it feels like there are more international students than British students, which is incredible as an international student because I got to meet people from all over the world, but I also got to meet a lot of Americans who were there with me. So I think when I was 20, 21, that was a very comforting thing to be surrounded by Americans and to kind of feel like we were almost picking up our university in America and dropping it in the UK and having this fun experience. But I think when I was looking for a graduate program, I did want more of a British experience. And I think I've gotten that. I've gotten to learn more about the UK and I've gotten to learn more about traditions. And I think being in Wales, it's given me a very different perception of the UK than I would have gotten living in London and living in Oxford because Wales is different. And as Tom has covered a lot in Spare Thought, often gets overlooked. And so I think having that in the back of my mind and being able to live there for a year and understand Welsh traditions, Welsh heritage, Welsh people a little bit better was incredible for me, especially as someone who hopes to live in the UK for years to come. We'll see about visa stuff. We'll see how that all works. But I think that it's just given me a very important perspective to always keep devolution and the different parts of the UK in mind. So that was like a very diplomatic way of saying I love Cardiff. I'm so glad that I chose it, but those are all the different reasons.
For me, I think the course is very important. The modules that were being offered was very important. I had applied to 20 odd universities in the UK. I got through 6 of them, and Cardiff was my second choice, my first being LSE, of course. However, I'm very glad that I came to Cardiff because JOMEC had a very good reputation. I looked up on the professors quite a bit, and more importantly, on the research that they were doing, because I was really interested in what from that perspective. And a lot of the research that they were doing was around misinformation and misinformation in politics, in the media, the state of the media, and so on and so forth. And that was one of my driving forces of doing this course and kind of choosing a career and trying to make a career in this arena. So that really aligned, and that gave me a lot of confidence. So I definitely wanted to be here. Also, I think in hindsight, probably within a month, I realized that this is a way better place to live than London because there's a lot less hustle. It's nice to live in a smaller town. I've lived in a city which is comparable to the size of London. Delhi is as mad as it gets. But it was really nice to walk around everywhere, to get to know a lot of people from, different parts of UK. Because our course, political communication, had most of them were from the UK. And I was, apart from Manuel, were the only people who were international students in that sense. So it was quite nice to gain a lot of insight into UK political systems, to know that they are very much aware of what's happening in India, to reinforce the idea that I had that the political systems are very similar in India and in the UK, kind of made it easier for me to sort of get through the course and so on. And I think all those factors kind of, drew me to Cardiff and kind of made me want to live here and really made this a very enjoyable experience. I think the style of education is really nice. It was a very pleasant change for me. I think it's been a great experience being here, getting to know a lot of people, not just from my course, but from journalism, media communication, from digital media and society. I've met people from the United States, from Pakistan, which as Indians we don't usually get to. And of course, a lot of people from the UK, which has been quite amazing, to be very honest.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, that's something that, universities, if you're not like pro-immigration and internationalism and part of a global community before you come to university, then you definitely will be afterwards. If you're mixing with a variety of people. And I always felt that from when I was at University of Kent in Canterbury, for example, that we were at the time donned ourselves the European University, which obviously financially hasn't done very well because of Brexit and all those other things. But you had like loads of, I remember going to a house party and everyone was French. It was great, and I didn't speak any French. And then it was me and my Bulgarian friend and my German friend, and then everyone else was French. So you get cool experiences like that. And then fast forward to coming to Cardiff. Cardiff wasn't my first choice. My first choice was Leeds. I got a place to study at Leeds to do political communication there. And they had a far more integrated program between the School of Journalism and the School of Politics, which Cardiff used to do. But because of the School of Journalism moving into the city centre, logistically, it was a bit more challenging to operate a program like that. So the reason why I picked Cardiff was I was going through everything. I was even going to rent my flat out and all of that sort of stuff. And I'd gone down that process. The person that came round to look at the flat, evaluated it and everything, said, well, it's going to be difficult to find someone to fill this. It's a really nice property, but, people want to live here for more than a year. The person leaves. I sit down by the window in my flat, and the sun comes shining in. And I thought, actually, I want to stay here. You know, I bought this flat and I want to stay here. And so I thought, well, you know what, I'm going to apply for Cardiff, and there will be that. This is a compromise because, you know, my partner's relatively close. My friends are here. I'm feeling as the years pass more Welsh, as I arrived in Wales 11 years ago thinking I was British, realised I was English, and now I'm getting to the position that I feel like I'm Welsh. And Laura McAllister said I could call myself Welsh, so as long as Laura McAllister backs me up, then, you know, anyone else that resists that, I will quote her, and she's happy to be quoted. And yeah, so I really enjoyed my experience of studying at Cardiff. I had this weird thing because I'd worked previously at the institution as well. It was quite a strange thing. And I suppose my regret really is that I didn't let go of that sooner and just enjoyed the moment and the experience and not being weirded out by that. And I think I would have liked to have mixed more widely with people outside of the School of Journalism. We're we're quite a tight unit because we're right by the station, but I felt like the world was carrying on outside and we were in the School of Journalism. So sometimes it felt like that. And yeah, highlights are obviously like doing a bit of student radio with you, Lily and Joe, interviewing the Vice Chancellor. That International Women's Day episode that we did was really fun, putting that together. Joe always seemed to be on the loud mic, which was always fun. So that sort of thing. But just being in class, the camaraderie that we had together, you know, there were lots of ups and downs. And organisationally, I think our year got a bit hit because there was an over-recruitment of students. So often the timetable sort of let us down quite a lot. And we won't talk about the second research module that we had to do, which was not as fun. If anyone's studying PRIP 1 and 2, be prepared. And yeah, so, and then highlights were being a far better student as a mature student, you know, 10 years after graduating than I ever was as an undergraduate, and actually appreciating learning more, interrogating the reading, and actually finding my brain working differently and thinking more critically. As a result, I'm probably a lot more cynical about the world and decisions that are made. But I feel like, you know, learning about Edward Said and learning about Stuart Hall and, you know, being critical of the media ownership. Before I did my course, I was really naive in how I consumed my social media, how I read the news. And now I'm always thinking, okay, so what's the angle here? What's this person trying to say? Who owns this media platform? Is this a trusted source of information? And obviously all the skills that we've learned in doing the podcast as well. Like I could never have imagined that I'd be part of 2 really fun podcasts, you know, and to be part of a wider network of people as well. So yeah, they're the sort of the main highlights. And then the other, something I'm proud of, but also feel like I could have improved a bit more, was I campaigned to create a Vice President International Students. And I'm really proud of that because it means that international students are a bit more fairly represented in the Students' Union and the wider university. But if I'd planned things a bit better, if I'd worked on the political comms a bit better, I would have built a broader coalition of people involving more of the sabbatical officer team and trying to win them over, and creating something a bit more sustained. But I threw so much of my energy at it, and then I had so many other things going on that in the end I just couldn't, you know, follow through with that. And I think it's a really important lesson that you can really care about something that you're campaigning for, but you have to have a vision beyond that moment of the thing that you achieve, because that is literally then just the first step towards wherever you want to get to. So whether it's like creating a new position in a students' union, or whether it's campaigning for a cause that you really care about, to do with, you know, your education or health or well-being or the climate, getting a law changed is one thing. It's also then the bit that comes afterwards. and the support that you have to sustain and the coalitions you have to build after that. So, they're the sort of main things that I've learned, really. And but I think out of everything, doing all the podcasting stuff has been really fun, and I love it. So that's me.
That was so inspirational. I don't really want to follow that with mine. I'll be quick with mine because I think I would say that my highlight was being around people who are very passionate about what I'm passionate about. I think going to a liberal arts school in the US and then going to Oxford for a year as well, the people around me were they were interested in very different things, which I think served me a lot when I was growing up. My friends, studied STEM subjects and humanities and all of this stuff. And I think that was great for my own academic development and just my own intellectual development because I was talking with people who were passionate about so many different things. However, when I got to Cardiff, I had kind of a hard time stepping into it, but I realized, oh my gosh, these people around me, when I talk about Be the Change podcast, for example, all of these people think that it's like the sickest thing ever. And like what I'm doing is very cool, which I just didn't really have all the time at my undergrad because people just didn't always get like, why a podcast? Like how much time are you spending on this? It was just never received, I guess, as well as a lot of the people that I met in Cardiff. Tom, you being one, Sid, you being another. You guys were just like, oh my God, this is awesome. And I think that encouraged me a lot more to like open up and then to tell more people about it. And I think this is also kind of my downside because I wish that I would have done this sooner, where of course that led to Tom, you, me, and Joe starting our radio show. And then, of course, Sid, you joining us for the podcast, which I wish that we could have done so much sooner and we could have done it in Cardiff with like the studio and everything. So I think that it was just really great to open up in that way and to share Be the Change with people and just my passion for storytelling with people who really got it and also had that passion. It's the nature of an MA, I guess, is that all of these people want to be in this space and they're so passionate about it. But I just wish that I would have told people sooner and made these connections sooner because it only came around our second term, I think, when we really started to connect, Sid, Tom, and really like start to get into this work together. So I think it's incredible, but I wish it would have been sooner. So double-edged sword. But Sid, what's yours?
I'm usually someone who celebrates small victories. I really like that. I think every small little thing adds up to something big. And in this case, I think the highlight for me was that I managed to, graduate and complete the course successfully. I didn't get a distinction, which is fine, but I did all of this entire process, from a stage where there was a lot going on in my life. I lost my dad. I had to manage everything, and then apply for universities. I was doing a course in public policy at the same time back in India. I was working, part-time with an NGO as well. I was handling everything at home, the finances, whatnot, and kind of did all of that. Said everything, came here. There was always this question that I had that, will I be able to fit in? I'm going to be definitely way older than everybody over there. And then I met Tom and I was like, I'm good, So,
Thanks for that, Sid.
couldn't resist, mate. So, I think just the entire journey, and I think it just went very well. It was really good. So, that's the entire journey has been my highlight. I would look at it that way. I just wish this program was 2 years instead of a 1 year program. It would have been so much more in depth. It would have been, I mean, I would have to become the Prime Minister of UK to do something like that. But, but yeah, 2 years program in political communication with far more research, like with like a 3-month internship over the summer, had they had a a tie-up with BBC Wales, and we would have been like political analysts, student analysts over there, analyzing, Welsh politics and so on, and getting work placements at the Senate. I mean, it would have been amazing. So that's something which I wish was the case. But having said that, I think in that 1 year itself, we've done a lot, and we did a lot. And I completely agree with Lily. I wish we had just started a little sooner. Maybe before Christmas. That's what I think.
It's cool, yeah. So I think that's a great summation of how we all feel about our experiences at Cardiff. And I fully agree, Sid. I think we should have had that 2-year experience, to get to know everyone, to get more sort of practical experience, because you have to throw so much into 1 year. And if you get knocked off course slightly, whether that's a bad grade, if you sort of have, if you're unwell or something happens, in your personal life, whatever, it can really put you off course. So I really would advocate for that. I think, like, for example, in Scotland, all undergraduate courses are 4 years. And I think, is that the same in the US where they're 4 years? So yeah, I think a 2-year master's program would be awesome.
Sorry, everyone. I was nodding, by the way, also, just so everyone who's listening obviously knows.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, they are 4 years.
Yeah. It should be like a very close thing to the microphone, and Lily's nodding in agreeing.
Nodding.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I think from our discussion today, it's worth sort of concluding on some final thoughts. So, in May 2022, I was part of a tour group walking the grounds of Harvard University. And we stopped at Harvard Yard. Behind us was the Memorial Church. Ahead of us, the second largest library in the United States, the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library. And so Harvard Yard is where welcome and orientation takes place. It's at the start of the academic year. It's where student life converges, and close to 97% of Harvard students live on campus. But when students' finals are completed, they don't leave campus. They actually stay until graduation. And I think this is the problem at UK universities, that there's this gap between you finish, like we finished in September, October time, and we've had to wait all this time through to July before we can sort of celebrate. And so Harvard Yard becomes this place where their journey completes. It's like the circle completes, a bit of a sort of hero's journey type thing. And I think the problem that universities in the UK face now is, what are they for? What the central question is, what are universities for? Are they purely for education? Are they for scholarship? Are they for research? Do they exist to train doctors, scientists, and philosophers of the future? Should teachers be taught there, and nurses for that matter? Are they big, broad churches, or are they small, elitist institutions? Do they lean on tradition or embrace modernity, or try to balance both? Are they sitting on hills looking down at the towns and cities they share a name with? Or are they woven into the urban fabric, part of daily life? Who attends them? Are they people from private school? Are they state schools? Are they adults returning to education? What is the mix of home and international students? Are they truly diverse centres of learning? We haven't asked these questions enough. And that's exactly why so many university leaders now find themselves stuck between a rock and a very hard place. Politicians frequently talk about world-beating universities. They are, after all, the institutions that developed vaccines, advanced our understanding of the world, trained leaders of every political stripe. And yes, they have trained the teachers that teach our kids, and the nurses and doctors who have cared for us and the people we love. And many of those in power today are the beneficiaries of a higher education system they now seemingly willing to disown and abandon. They reaped the rewards of free education and burdened millions of young people with debt. And they expect young people to remain enthusiastic about work, about society, about giving back. Too many political decisions over the last 20 years have robbed young people of security, opportunity, and hope. And the education divide between those with resources, connections, and privilege and those without broke open during the pandemic and has only widened since. So educational outcomes have regressed, school attendance has dropped, and student satisfaction has plummeted. and not to mention the mental health crisis that comes with that. So when I was supporting students during the pandemic, I was part of a phone service, basically, where we phoned up students. And most of the people I phoned were perfectly fine. But there was one student I particularly remember who was living in a one-bed flat. And her husband was back in her home country serving in the armed forces. And she had a daughter with her that was not even 2 years old. We spoke at length several times. I think the calls helped. I hope they did. And it made me realize that in times of real struggle, there's often only so much a university can do. So my colleagues and I were contending with unprecedented situation where we were expected to perform miracles. Millions of pounds were pumped into the student experience. And some initiatives worked, others didn't. Lots of students across the sector were let down. And universities were told to open their doors, unsure themselves of what the student experience would even look like. And it laid bare what a university education is and what it becomes without the social life, the community, the chance to connect. There were no years abroad, no funny nights out, no chance to meet up for coffee or pull long shifts in the library, no room for debate, for impromptu questions after lectures. The experience was reduced to a screen, hours of watching, essays to write, work to submit. And I remember having a chat with my boss at the time, who's now a really good friend. And we were talking about, what information do students need and what experiences do they need to thrive? And I said, well, it comes back to that old analogy, right? You give a person a fish and they feed themselves for a day. She nodded and said, we need to give them a net so they can fish for life. We concluded that we were giving students the nets and pointing them towards the sea, saying, there go and fish. In short, we handhold students through university, or we can give them the tools to work it out for themselves. Or better still, we can work with them, teach them how to use those tools and walk alongside them as they build their lives that are fulfilled, meaningful, and ready for a world that is often unrelenting, confusing, and chaotic. We can help shape them into active, energized citizens who can change the world. When universities get it right, that happens. I've seen it with my own eyes, and we see, on this podcast, we talk about it in the network, we talk about it on Be the Change. So I'm the product of an education system where I was lucky enough to have inspiring teachers, lecturers, and support staff. And I've met some incredible people, peers, and students, made lifelong friends. But my fear is that in this moment of turmoil, we risk losing what makes our university special. The heart, the soul, the community, the exchange of ideas, and we sacrifice all of that in the name of balancing the books to wait it out for the next crisis, moving numbers from one spreadsheet column to another. University leaders, politicians, and policymakers need to get their heads out of the spreadsheets. They need to check their privilege, talk to students and staff, and create a vision, a real plan to bring the sector back from the brink. Because if they do not do that, this country and our nations within it will lose the communities of education and learning we've been building for decades. So yeah, they're my final thoughts.
Incredibly well said, Tom. I think that you hit on so many topics that we touched on in our own anecdotes, I think, throughout the episode, but that was just incredible. Very, very well put. And we're all living in the UK in a very special time where hopefully these conversations are being had. Maybe this episode will find its way into the right person's earbuds. We'll see. We can do everything in our power to try to put it there. But that was incredible. Sid, any last thoughts?
No, I think Tom just nailed it. That was just incredible.
That's all from us this week. You can find more of these episodes wherever you found this episode. Please like, subscribe, and share our show so we can reach more people and drive up interest in the podcast. My name is Lily Mott.
I'm Tom Spare.
And I'm Sid Kurapati. You've been listening to the Political Dispatch.